This is NTD Evening News. Live from our NTD Global Headquarters in New York City, here is Tiffany Meyer.
Good evening, and thank you for joining us tonight. Atop the same cliff in Normandy, where Army Rangers fought against the Nazis on D-Day, President Biden today asked Americans to defend democracy in our time. The major speech comes as Biden is seeking to tell voters at home that democracy is on the ballot in November. NTD's White House correspondent Iris Tao has more from Normandy.
And President Biden on Friday gave a speech about freedom and democracy right here at Pointe du Hoc in Normandy, where President Ronald Reagan gave one of his most famous speeches 40 years ago about the Cold War. This is an 100-foot tall cliff where Army Rangers 80 years ago on D-Day scaled under heavy gunfire to successfully seize German positions. Biden today praised the bravery of these Rangers and also used this to call on Americans to fulfill their duty of protecting democracy.
They're not asking us to scale these cliffs. They're asking us to do our job, to protect freedom in our time, to defend democracy.
Biden is trying to target audiences at home in the U.S. While he did not mention Trump by name, he called on Americans to protect the freedoms of our time and stand up to aggression both abroad and at home. Meanwhile, Biden also used the occasion to call for more support for Ukraine, stressing the need to stand up to Putin.
They stood against Hitler's aggression. Does anyone doubt that they would want America to stand up against Putin's aggression here in Europe today?
Earlier on Friday, Biden met with Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky in Paris, where he announced another over $200 million in Ukraine aid and apologized that it took so long.
I apologize for those weeks of not knowing what's going to happen in terms of funding. I assure you, the United States is going to stand with you.
And during a state visit to France this weekend, Biden will talk more about the future of Ukraine with French President Emmanuel Macron. And next week, Biden will head to Italy for the G7 summit, where leaders will talk about using frozen Russian assets to send more aid to Ukraine. Reporting from Normandy, France, Iris Tao, NTD News.
Hunter Biden's defense team stopped short of calling the first son's uncle, James Biden, to the stand. The decision came during the lunch break after Hunter Biden's own daughter, Naomi Biden, testified about her dad's drug addiction. The judge excused the jury for the day, giving the defense time over the weekend to decide whether Hunter Biden should testify. Our legal correspondent Arlene Richards has more details about Naomi Biden's testimony and the defense's sudden decision.
In an unexpected move on Friday, Hunter Biden's defense team halted their case. The sudden move came not long after Hunter's own daughter, Naomi Biden, gave some emotional testimony about his addiction, some of it bringing tears to her father. The eldest daughter testified her father was doing better than he had been in a long time when she saw him at a Los Angeles rehab facility in August or September 2018. She described her dad as hopeful and positive. This was to counter testimony given by Hallie Biden and Zoe Keston about Hunter's perceived drug use in October 2018. Naomi said her dad loaned his truck to her in October, the same truck where Hallie found the gun and cocaine residue. Naomi said the truck was clean, no drugs, and no paraphernalia. Prosecutors have been mostly highlighting the seriousness of Hunter Biden's drug problem through highly personal and often revealing testimony, saying he lied on a federal transaction form at the time that he bought the gun. Naomi said she never saw her father using drugs and she didn't know what he looked like when he was using them. Prosecutor Leo Wise questioned Naomi about text messages she exchanged with her dad. Wise asked her if she remembered her dad sending her a text shortly before midnight on October 17, 2018. Do you know what your father was doing at 2 o'clock in the morning and why he was asking for the car then? Wise asked. No, Naomi replied. On the afternoon of October 18th, Naomi wanted to spend time with her dad, but he was unreachable. Wise asked if she knew why Hunter was so unreachable. She said no. Naomi left the stand with a tear streaming down her cheek. She gave her father a hug, then slowly walked out of the courtroom with her husband. Hunter's uncle, James Biden, was waiting in a witness room expecting to testify in the afternoon. But just after lunch, the defense told the judge James would not be testifying, and neither would their experts. Afterwards, the judge dismissed the jury for the day. The defense is expected to make a decision over the weekend about whether or not to call Hunter Biden to the stand. Depending on their decision, the prosecution may have to prepare a rebuttal case. Court proceedings will resume on Monday. Arlene Richards, NTD News.
Former President Trump reportedly raised $12 million yesterday at a fundraising dinner in San Francisco. Tech venture capitalists, including David Sacks, held a reception and dinner with Trump in Sacks' mansion. Tickets cost as much as $300,000 per individual or $500,000 per couple, and the event was sold out. San Francisco is known to be heavily liberal. President Biden won 85% of the city's vote in the 2020 election, but a growing number of high-profile local venture capitalists and crypto investors are now supporting Trump after the Biden administration imposed a series of business regulations. San Francisco is still a fertile fundraising ground for Democrats. Vice President Kamala Harris was in the city for her own fundraiser at a music venue on Wednesday. Turning to developments in Arizona with the prosecution over the 2020 election, former Trump White House Chief of Staff Mark Meadows was arraigned earlier today. He pleaded not guilty to charges of conspiracy, fraud, and forgery. Another defendant, Michael Roman, who worked for Trump's 2020 campaign, also pleaded not guilty. Arizona Attorney General Chris Mays brought the case and accuses the men of being involved in efforts to keep Trump in power. Meadows and Roman are both defendants in the Georgia RICO case alongside Trump. Roman also faces separate charges in Wisconsin over alternate Trump electors. 52 Trump attorneys, advisors, and others now face charges over the aftermath of the 2020 presidential election in Georgia, Arizona, Wisconsin, and Michigan. The number of Americans looking for work is up, and automaker Kia is recalling some of its SUVs. Here is NTD's Don Ma with today's Business Matters.
U.S. job growth accelerated far more than expected in May. America's employers added a vigorous 272,000 jobs. So the Labor Department's closely watched employment report on Friday also showed that the unemployment rate ticked up to 4.0%. This is keeping the Federal Reserve on track to hold off starting to cut interest rates until September at the earliest. So, while the labor market has softened in recent months, it's still a solid clip, allowing the Fed to take its time so far in deciding when to begin lowering borrowing costs. So employment increases were primarily seen in the healthcare, government, and leisure and hospitality sectors, and aligning with recent trends. So these three sectors collectively added 68,000, 43,000, and 42,000 positions, contributing to over half of the overall gains. So in terms of wages, average hourly earnings surpassed expectations, increasing by 0.4% for the month and 4.1% compared to a year earlier.
As the Israel-Hamas war enters its 9th month, heavy fighting continues as the U.S. attempts to negotiate a ceasefire. NTD's Fiona G has the latest updates.
The temporary pier in Gaza built by the U.S. military has been repaired and reconnected today after heavy storms damaged it 2 weeks ago. Before the damage, over 1,100 tons of aid had been delivered via the causeway. Despite initial struggles, U.S. Central Command now hopes to move 1 million pounds of food and supplies through the pier and into Gaza every 2 days. The Israel Defense Forces named yesterday 9 Hamas terrorists that they killed in a school airstrike. They say that there were around 30 terrorists in the 3 rooms they targeted. IDF spokesman Rear Admiral Daniel Hagari said the strike was carried out after Israeli intelligence determined there were no women or children inside those classrooms. He did not deny that civilians were still killed in the strike. Hamas claims that 33 Palestinians were killed in the attack. Israel is criticizing international media for taking Hamas's reports at face value without considering the individuals' possible terrorist connections. The Associated Press has also released an analysis that the death rate for Palestinian women and children has dropped from 60% to 40%. This is based on data from Hamas's health ministry that cannot be verified. The ministry continues to claim that over 2/3 of the dead are women and children. Israel says the Hamas-run department is inflating numbers for political gains.
I have quite a bit of stuff.
Meanwhile, the United Nations put both Israel and Hamas on their so-called list of shame. The list singles out states and armed groups that have gravely violated children's rights. These include Russia, the Islamic State, and Al-Qaeda. Israel is the first democratic country included on the list. It says that this decision will only encourage Hamas to continue using schools and hospitals as covers to garner sympathy. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu called the decisions delusional. Hamas also seems set to reject Israel's latest hostage release and truce deal. Hamas leader Yahya Sinwar says they will not agree to surrender their guns for anything less than a permanent ceasefire, a demand Israel has repeatedly ruled out. Secretary of State Antony Blinken will travel to the Middle East next week for further negotiations. Washington is trying to pressure Israel and Hamas to accept a ceasefire deal. Fiona G., NTD News.
Welcome back. I'm Tiffany Meyer. Former President Trump's first campaign event since the historic conviction. His main focus, tackling illegal immigration. But the American Civil Liberties Union, ACLU, has plans to oppose his agenda. NTD's Ariane Pastar has the immigration update.
I'm thrilled to be back in beautiful Arizona with thousands and thousands of crowd.
Former President Trump speaking in Phoenix on Thursday night, holding his first campaign event since the historic conviction on felony charges last week. He used most of the speech to talk about the dangers of illegal immigration.
In Venezuela, crime is down 72% because they've taken their criminals from Caracas and all of these different places and they've dumped them in the United States.
Just this week, President Biden passed an executive order meant to limit the number of asylum seekers to 2,500 a day.
Doing nothing is not an option. We have to act.
Trump now says he would implement changes that are even more strict. But the American Civil Liberties Union, or ACLU, is already announcing plans to oppose his agenda. They released this memo on Thursday, saying Trump plans to attack human rights at the border. The ACLU successfully blocked several of Trump's immigration plans during his first term in office. And they're planning to do so again, saying just as it was from 2017 to 2021, litigation will be a critical component of the response. The ACLU also plans to use lobbying and working with liberal officials. And lastly, a large group of illegal immigrants is camping next to a busy highway in Washington state. They're trying to get the attention of local officials.
We're not sure how long that's going to last, to continue to push for dignified and long-term housing for the migrant community here.
They're calling on the local government to allow them to stay at a motel near the encampment. Next month, the state will give $5 million to the county, which might change the housing situation. Ariane Pastar, NTD News.
Earlier, we spoke with NTD News contributor A. Scott Bolden about President Biden's executive order on the border crisis. Bolden is the former chair of the D.C. Democratic Party and the former New York Assistant District Attorney. A. Scott Bolden, thank you so much for joining us. Great to have you back on the show.
Thank you for having me.
Now, President Biden took executive action this week to restrict asylum at the border. This is as polls show that immigration is a top issue for voters. Now, Democrats are praising the move as a necessary measure to respond to those voter concerns. First, what is your view on this and how effective it'll be?
Well, I don't think Biden had much choice with the bipartisan legislation stalled in Congress, with Donald Trump nixing it in regard to the House even taking it up, and with over 2,500, 5,000 or more coming across the borders illegally. I don't think Joe Biden had much choice here. He probably should have done it a little sooner than later, but he's done it now. He's got broad authority under 212F to shut down the border. This essentially shuts down the border or limits the capacity to 2,500 persons a day. We meet that criteria on a regular basis if you look at the reports and the research on it. And so it's a good thing to get some control of the border, but it's not going to be enough. One, we need Mexico to cooperate in repatriating many of these immigrants from other countries, either to Mexico or through Mexico. And then we need money. I mean, we need that's the congressional piece to it. Need money to hire more judges, more security on the border, more technology. And Congress just is unwilling to do that during an election year. So, but this is a good, strong first step. Surprisingly, the Republicans aren't applauding it. You would think they would applaud it because they've been pushing the president to do this. They haven't so far. They say it's too little too late. So I don't think Joe Biden's going to ever win with the Republican Party one way or the other.
Now, on that note, actually, also a lot of progressive lawmakers and some advocacy groups are criticizing this move. The ACLU is saying it's planning to file a lawsuit against it. They say Biden's executive action is similar to the one implemented by Trump in 2018, which they call, quote, illegal. Where do you see this going legally?
Well, the courts will weigh in. Eventually, you know, under Trump, the Supreme Court struck down 2 of his bans. The third ban, as it was structured, was found to be legally enforceable. And I think as we go through these machinations and we go through the legal processes, I think it'll be ultimately be held up for the same reasons that the Trump order or ban was held up, but for very different reasons. Here, you cannot have a humanitarian crisis at the border with thousands of people coming through, with fentanyl coming through, with terrorists or people on the watch list coming through. It's just untenable. It wasn't that we did that Biden doesn't want immigration. You know, immigration has a great deal to do with the strength of our economy. I just read a report on that through the Washington Post. And so this is really to not just save the country, but bring some order or some level of order of this chaos. But everyone, it'll limit those who can seek asylum successfully, and they'll be repatriated back to their countries or to Mexico. So we'll have to see. We won't know the full impact of it for another probably 3 to 6 months. And remember, we're in a presidential election year, so anything can happen.
How do we ensure that legal immigration does continue while putting a stem to the illegal immigration part?
Well, we got to encourage people to come through the port sites legally. That's one thing. Secondly, we've got to have a strong partnership, a stronger partnership with Mexico to enforce laws against the cartels, not just for illegal immigration, if you will, but for drugs, as well as for people on the terrorist watch list. We've got to have strong partnerships with Mexico. That partnership has been strengthened with this executive order, and in more recent last 6 months, Mexico's been doing a better job on their side of the border. But it's an ongoing process. It's a daily challenge for both countries. And, you know, the majority of the people coming across the border are not from Mexico. You have people coming across the border from the Middle East, from China, and at least one other South American country. And so this is a real challenge for our Border Patrol people, which is why the money is so important to protect that border, if you will, and to protect the northern border, too. We don't talk about the northern border. If you talk to Canadian officials and border states on the northern border, law enforcement and immigration officers will say, we've got the same challenge. We're just not talking about the northern border.
Indeed. A. Scott Bolden, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
If you are visiting New York City this summer, be prepared to pay higher hotel prices. A one-night stay could set you back over $300, a record high. 135 out of New York City's 680 hotels have been converted into shelters for illegal immigrants. That's about 1 in 5. Under the Sanctuary Hotel program, the city pays hotels up to $185 a night per room to house illegal immigrants and the homeless. Many hotels jumped on the deal after suffering heavy losses during COVID-19. 65,000 illegal immigrants now live in converted hotels. Meanwhile, the city is also cracking down on Airbnbs, practically banning short-term rental properties. These properties once accounted for over 10% of tourist accommodation. Tourist numbers for the Big Apple are predicted to match pre-pandemic levels this year. The rise in demand and severe lack of supply means hotels are now free to jack up their prices. At a rally commemorating the 10th annual National Gun Violence Awareness Day, Vice President Kamala Harris expressed her support for more restrictive gun laws.
I'm in favor of the Second Amendment. and we need an assault weapons ban. I support the Second Amendment, and we need universal background checks. I support the Second Amendment, and we need red flag laws.
The vice president is also endorsing Maryland County Executive Angela Alsobrooks for the U.S. Senate. If elected, Alsobrooks says she'll vote for measures to combat illegal gun trafficking and implement universal background checks for gun purchases. Alsobrooks is facing former Maryland Governor Larry Hogan in the Senate race. While he was governor, Hogan suspended Maryland's strict standards for concealed carry applicants after the U.S. Supreme Court struck down a similar law in New York. The Biden administration has rolled out a number of policies aimed at increasing background checks for firearm purchases. A date has been set for Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's anticipated address to Congress. The address is showcasing tensions within the Democratic Party, with lawmakers divided over Israel's approach to the war in Gaza. Our Washington correspondent Luis Martinez has more on this story.
July 24th has been confirmed as the date that Benjamin Netanyahu, the Israeli Prime Minister, will address a joint session of Congress. The invitation was orchestrated by Speaker of the House Mike Johnson, and it has created tensions among Democrats like Senator Bernie Sanders, who has already announced he will not be attending, or like Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who is still on the fence about it.
I don't think that it is productive right now whatsoever for Netanyahu to be addressing Congress. I'm figuring it out, but I certainly do not approve of it. Potentially may not attend.
Other House Democrats like Representative Jared Moskowitz from Florida disagree with international criticism against the Israeli government, in particular against the International Criminal Court's decision to seek arrest warrants against Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and Israeli Defense Minister.
The ICC thing is outrageous, okay? They have no jurisdiction over Israel. The reason why the last couple of months, the reason why the Israelis are in Rafah right now is because Hamas has refused to agree to a ceasefire in release for the hostages.
The House of Representatives passed this week a legislation that will sanction the International Criminal Court for seeking arrest warrants against Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and Israeli Defense Minister. 44 Democrats voted with Republicans to pass this bill.
Failing to act here in the Congress would make us complicit with the ICC's illegitimate actions. We must not stay silent, and we must stand with our allies.
The July 24th address will be the fourth time Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu addresses a joint session of Congress, becoming the only head of state to have done it that many times and breaking a tie with former Prime Minister Winston Churchill, who addressed the joint session of the U.S. Congress 3 times. Last time Benjamin Netanyahu addressed the U.S. Congress was in 2015, and over 50 Democrats boycotted that speech. Reporting from Washington, D.C., Luis Eduardo Martinez, NTD News.
Joining me now to discuss the latest updates in the war is Anders Core. He's the publisher of the Journal of Political Risk and principal of Core Analytics. Anders, thank you so much for joining us. Great to see you again. Now, to begin, a new AP data analysis finds that women and children in Gaza are killed less frequently as the war continues. In October, it was around 60% and fell below 40% in April. Now, that's according to Gaza's Hamas-run health ministry data, which cannot be verified. That is despite Hamas still claiming that percentage to be much higher. Given that, what do you make of this trend and what it means for the level of civilian casualties that we could be looking at here?
Israel has been trying, since the start of the war, I think, to decrease the civilian casualties that have been happening. At the beginning of the war, of course, anger was up in Israel, and I think there is perhaps less pressure on Israel to decrease civilian casualties. As pressure has grown on Israel, I think it's making quite a bit more effort. It's always made effort, but it's been making quite a bit more effort to decrease civilian casualties.
Expanding on that, Israel came under global fire for striking an UNRWA school, which Israel said housed terrorists. Now, an IDF spokesman has revealed the identities of 9 terror operatives that were killed in the attack and said that its intel showed no women or children were in the targeted rooms. How do you see Israel balancing this with the need to go after terrorists who want to destroy it while limiting civilian casualties and global media condemnation?
That most recent strike is a real example of Israel's attempt to use precision weapons to hit a container in which the terrorists were allegedly located right next to a UN facility. And I think that's part of the problem, is that Hamas is hiding its terrorists right within these facilities, which is actually against international law.
On the humanitarian aid front, the U.S.-built Pier is now back in operation. That's after 5-foot waves damaged it in May. Reports note the goal now is to get 1 million pounds of food and supplies through to Gaza every other day. Now, the last time the pier was operational, 16 vehicles carrying aid headed to Gaza, but 11 were taken over by crowds before reaching UN warehouses, with reports noting the civilians were left starving. How successful do you see the Pier operation being this time around?
The Pier operation hasn't been that successful, but it is a good attempt by the Army to do something for civilians in Gaza. The Air Force has also dropped supplies. There have been multiple countries that have tried to get food aid in. Part of the problem is it's difficult to move it through Israel. So, I think countries have been trying their best to get food aid into Gaza. The success rate is mixed, unfortunately.
And Anders, in terms of an end to the conflict, Secretary of State Antony Blinken is traveling to the Middle East next week to press Gaza for a ceasefire. Now, this comes as the Biden administration is pushing Middle East allies to make threats to Hamas to push for a Gaza ceasefire deal. Where do you see this going?
Hamas has to release the hostages. That's the first step to ending the war. Without releasing the hostages, you can never expect a country where its people are being held hostage to just stop and do nothing. So Israel will keep fighting until those hostages are released. That's the bottom line.
Anders Core, publisher of the journal Political Risk and principal of Core Analytics, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
You may be able to get a good deal on an electric vehicle through Costco. Car makers are turning to the popular wholesale company to help with a pileup of unsold EVs. Here's the story.
Unsold electric vehicles are piling up as carmakers struggle to sell them. Some are using the Costco Auto program to help. It connects shoppers with dealers to arrange sales of new and pre-owned cars with prearranged pricing and potential discounts.
Their auto program can be hit and miss. If you walk into a dealer and you say, listen, I can get an additional $1,000 discount on this Chevy Blazer EV if I buy it through Costco, what can you do for me? And you'll find that the dealer might say, I'll give you $1,200.
Automotive expert Lauren Fix says to find the lowest price, using Costco's price as a bargaining chip. It may not be the lowest you could pay. Costco says it updates prices every month to make sure they're competitive. The company has facilitated an average of over 500,000 car sales annually over the past 5 years. In 2023, 7% of requests were for electric vehicles. But EV sales are still struggling. Out of all cars sold in 2023, only 7.6% were all electric.
They don't like the restrictions of the charging network, having to charge at home, can't go on long road trips. There's too many stops. The cost of insurance is higher. The cost of the vehicle is higher.
For those looking for an EV, Fix says, check if there's a fast charging station in your area. Contact your insurance agent to learn what the rates are and check out available discounts.
The FDA is asking states to discourage or stop the sale of raw milk to the public. The concern is the exposure and possible transmission of H5N1 bird flu. In an open letter, the agency urged states to issue more stern warnings or consider using regulatory powers to curb the sale of raw milk in areas where dairy cattle have tested positive. Raw milk can carry high levels of the virus because bird flu appears to infect cows through their udders. It is not known whether humans can get bird flu by drinking contaminated milk. But 3 dairy workers exposed to the milk have been infected, as well as cats on farms with infected cows. On Friday, Minnesota became the 10th state to report infected herds. The Department of Agriculture says a total of 82 herds in the U.S. have tested positive for bird flu. Welcome back. I'm Tiffany Meyer. Now for your sports news. We're joined by NTD's Dave Martin. Dave, a lot going on in sports day, but let's start in boxing as the much anticipated Mike Tyson-Jake Paul fight has been postponed, now rescheduled for November 15th. What's prompted this?
Yeah, it was Mike Tyson's health. He had a recent ulcer flare-up recently. Doctors advised him to limit his training. This fight was originally planned for July 20th, as you said, is moved to November 15th. But I think this whole thing kind of highlights how unusual this actually is. You know, Tyson, the former heavyweight champion, will be 58 years old, while Jake Paul is just 27. That 31-year gap is the largest ever in a sanctioned bout. Plus, Paul has reportedly put on a fair amount of weight, or really muscle, to be on par with Tyson. Tyson normally fought at 220 pounds. Jake Paul's last fight, he was at just 200, and last year was at 185. So even though he's much younger, boxing at a much heavier weight can take some adjusting. I think this extra time is actually going to help Jake Paul out a lot. But I think this is going to be a very highly anticipated match. Everyone tuned in to watch Tyson in his prime, and I think they're going to continue to do so for this November bout.
Looking at the French Open action today, both Carlos Alcaraz and Alexander Zverev won their semifinal matches and will meet in the finals on Sunday. How do they stack up against each other?
You know, this is a very even matchup. They met 9 times. Zverev has a slight edge at 5-4, but Alcaraz has won 2 of their 3 matches on clay, which is where this is going to be. Now, neither has won the French Open. I mean, that's really no surprise. Between Nadal and Djokovic, those two won 17 of the last 19 titles there. But I think with those two gone, we're waiting to see, you know, who's going to emerge as the next great player. Now, in that regard, Alcaraz has the advantage. He's only 21, but he already has 2 Grand Slam titles. Zverev is 6 years older at 27. He has yet to win his Grand Slam, but this is his best event. Now, this match will take place Sunday. Tomorrow is going to be the women's final. You'll have top-ranked Iga Swiatek against 15th-ranked Jasmine Paolini. Swiatek is looking for her 3rd straight French Open title there.
Shifting gears to women's softball, the Oklahoma Sooners beat the Texas Longhorns last night to win their 4th straight College World Series. How did they do it?
You know, mainly offense, especially those 2 games against Texas here in the finals. 8 runs in each of the last 2 games. That's after Texas had thrown 3 straight one-hit shutouts. You know, they also got a huge performance from pitcher Kelly Maxwell. Now, Maxwell transferred in this year from Oklahoma State. She pitched a complete game victory in Game 1, and then last night she got the last 4 outs for the save. Now, as you mentioned, this is Oklahoma's 4th straight national title. That's an NCAA record. And for their head coach, Patty Gassel, this is her 8th national title overall, so we've got quite a dynasty going on, really, with Oklahoma right now.
Looking now at hockey news, the NHL Stanley Cup Finals begin Saturday night as the Florida Panthers host the Edmonton Oilers. Who do you like in this series?
You know, I'm picking the Oilers to win it this time. They're slight underdogs, but they have Connor McDavid. Now, he's been there 9 years, and they've yet to get this far, but it seems like he's going to find a way to do it. I mean, he's the best player in the game, and he's been that way for a while. But his comments after they lost Game 3 to Dallas are really what stood out to me. They were down 2-1 at that point. Dallas had home ice advantage. He simply said something to the effect that he expected them to bounce back, and they really did. They won the next 3 games, and really their defense against the Stars and the previous series against the Canucks was very impressive. I mean, we already know about their great offense already. That said, though, Florida is tough. They're deep. I think this series is going to go the distance, but I think Connor McDavid and the Oilers are going to find a way to win, so I'm picking them to do it.
All right, well, Dave, as always, thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Tiff.
A massive heat dome stalling over the Southwest will push temperatures into the region well above 100 degrees through the weekend, forcing millions of Americans to endure extreme heat. NTD's Christina Corona talks with people in the area to find out how they are coping with the sizzling weather.
The peak of the first major heat wave hit the U.S. this week, but the hot weather didn't stop people from venturing outdoors to experience it. The heat wave persisted through Friday and will continue until the weekend, with Phoenix temperatures reaching 111 degrees. However, one Arizona couple woke up at 5 a.m. to hike Camelback Mountain, where a surprise proposal awaited.
So we started extra early. The views were beautiful. We didn't make it quite to the top because she was a little nervous with the heat. So I proposed to her when the sun rose right by the benches right up front, and she waited while I hiked the rest of it.
Even a Utah resident visited Arizona to celebrate a special occasion.
We came down to celebrate her 9th birthday, so we thought we'd come and check out Phoenix for a couple days. Got here last night, and it is hot.
It's so hot. Phoenix will see high temperatures of 106 degrees this weekend, with Las Vegas, Nevada reaching 105 degrees and Death Valley reaching 110 degrees. The heat didn't stop hundreds of supporters from attending former President Donald Trump's rally in Arizona.
We're out here supporting Trump, and it is excruciatingly hot out here. We're using bottles of water to cool down our kids.
She describes what the heat wave feels like.
A microwave, it's hot, and no matter how much water you use to cool yourself off, it dries up and you're just sweating and cooking out here in the heat.
Another attendee said,
"Yeah, it's uncomfortable, but for us, the discomfort that Trump's been put under by the heat from the left, and for us, we see it as illegitimate charges and stuff, so for us, coming out is the least we can do to support him at this point."
Whether you're going on a hike or just heading outdoors during the heat wave, remember to stay hydrated, wear loose clothing, try to find shade, and apply sunscreen to protect your skin. Christina Corona, NTD News, Los Angeles.
A California region steps up preparations for the upcoming wildfire season. NTD goes on a tour of the local watershed and wildfire prevention efforts.
One could call it summer housekeeping for the forest. Now, one coalition in California, which is prone to wildfires, is removing dead trees, plants, and dry fuel that could catch on fire. Today, we were looking at the current progress of the Los Gatos Creek Watershed Project. It's a 6-year project where agencies teamed up, including from the Santa Clara Fire Safe Council, San Jose Water Company, Mid-Peninsula Open Space, CAL FIRE, and more.
This area has seen fire before. We think it'll see fire again. You know, fire is a natural part of the ecosystem, and good fire helps control conflagrations.
What happens when a fire comes through here is that it results in a lot of sedimentation. It results in water that runs through the land that picks up the sediment and results in a burnt taste. It's very turbid, very muddy. And it's really hard for us to treat.
The VP of the local water company says around 100,000 people rely on this lake for water, which makes up 8% of the company's water portfolio. Replacing the water, if it's contaminated, would be 10 times more, he said. The green part of this map represents land that's been treated. The red and orange represent the next steps to treat the land and remove potential ember sources, which can move to parts of forests and residential areas of up to a mile and spark fires.
It's always a constant battle, especially the last couple winters. It's been great that there's been a lot of rain, but with a lot of rain is a lot of increase in vegetation.
The project received around $14.5 million in grants to treat 1,778 acres of land.
We're cleaning up the forest to mimic as if fire were to pass through. What this does, it creates space for other native trees to grow. It keeps certain trees that grow too fast and shade out other hardwood trees. It's amazing how much wildlife comes back out into the forest once it's opened up. The deer, the raptors, the wood rats.
The project started in 2021 and should be completed by 2027. But the ground operations manager told NTD that continuous maintenance of the land would be needed every 3 to 5 years. In Los Gatos, California, David Lamb, NTD News.
And that's all for today's news. For round-the-clock coverage, visit us at ntd.com or download our NTD app. Thanks for tuning in. I'm Tiffany Meyer. Good night.